Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. They were the most feared people in European history, yet they left us almost nothing written in their own hand. No monuments proclaim their victories. No libraries preserve their wisdom. No carved stones tell their version of the story. The Huns conquered half the known world and then vanished like smoke, leaving behind only the terrified accounts of their enemies, and a name that would echo through nightmares for 1,000 years. Here's what makes this even stranger. The people who terrorized Rome, who sent whole nations fleeing westward like leaves before a hurricane, who extracted tons of gold from the greatest empire on earth. These people disappeared so completely that we're not even certain what language they spoke. They built an empire that stretched from the Rhine to the Caspian Sea, yet we can't point to a single standing structure and say with certainty, the Huns built this. How does this happen? How does a force powerful enough to bring Rome to its knees leave barely a trace? How do we piece together the story of a people who wrote their history in hoofbeats and arrows rather than ink and stone? Tonight, we will walk through the shadows they cast, examining the fear they inspired, the world they transformed, and the mystery they left behind. We'll stand in Roman camps watching the horizon with dread, ride with Gothic refugees fleeing something worse than death, and sit in Attila's wooden palace as he decides the fate of civilizations. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. Feel time's current reversing, pulling you gently into the late 4th century AD, when the world was about to change. Picture the vast grasslands of Central Asia, stretching endlessly under an infinite sky. Hear the thunder of 10,000 horses. Smell the smoke of burning cities carried on the wind. We begin our journey here, at the edge of the known world, where dragons were said to dwell, and where something far more real was stirring. Where dragons begin. The Eurasian steppe. Close your eyes and picture an ocean of grass. Not the gentle meadows of Europe or the prairies of America, but something vaster, harsher, more absolute. The Eurasian steppe stretches from Hungary to Manchuria, 5,000 miles of grassland larger than all of Western Europe combined. In the 4th century AD, this was not empty space on Roman maps, where cartographers drew fanciful beasts. This was a complete world, with its own laws, its own logic, and its own masters. The steppe doesn't forgive weakness. Summer brings temperatures that can kill a man through dehydration in hours. Winter sees the thermometer plunge to -40, where exposed flesh freezes in minutes. There are no natural boundaries here. No mountains or forests to hide behind. No rivers wide enough to stop a determined enemy. You survive on the steppe by moving, always moving, following the grass that feeds your horses, the horses that are your life. Picture a Hun family in the year 350 AD. They own no land because the land cannot be owned, only crossed. Their wealth walks on 4 legs, horses, sheep, cattle. Their home moves with them, a felt tent called a yurt that can be assembled or packed in under an hour. The children learn to ride before they can properly walk. By age 5, they're helping to herd sheep. By age 10, they're shooting arrows from horseback at full gallop. By age 15, they're ready for war. This was not a primitive existence, but a sophisticated adaptation to one of Earth's most challenging environments. The steppe nomads developed technologies that settled peoples would take centuries to match. Their composite bows could punch through Roman armor at 200 yards. Their saddles and stirrups gave them stability in combat that no Roman cavalryman could achieve. Their preservation techniques could keep meat and milk edible for months without refrigeration. The steppe also shaped their society in ways Romans couldn't understand. Without fixed territories, political power couldn't rest on land ownership. Instead, it flowed from personal relationships, from the ability to attract and maintain followers. A successful steppe leader needed to provide victories, distribute wealth, and most importantly, demonstrate the favour of the sky god, Tengri, who ruled over an endless blue dome that was both ceiling and deity. But perhaps the most important thing the steppe taught was this: everything could change in an instant. A harsh winter could destroy half your herds. A stronger tribe could scatter your people to the winds. Climate shifts could turn good pasture into desert. This constant instability created warriors who were adaptable, ruthless, and always ready to move. When pressure built up in the east, when tribes were pushed and compressed like springs, that energy had to go somewhere. In the middle of the 4th century, something was building far to the east, beyond the knowledge of Rome or Persia. Population, pressure, climate change, or perhaps just the ambition of a brilliant leader, we'll never know for certain. But the springs were compressing, and when they released, the shock waves would reach from China to the Atlantic Ocean. Whispers from the east. You are a Gothic farmer, living north of the Danube River in the year 370 AD. Your name is Wulfila, and you've spent your entire life within 20 miles of where you were born. Your world is small but complete. Your wooden house with its thatched roof, your fields of barley and rye, your 6 cows and dozen sheep, your wife and 3 children. The Roman Empire is a distant presence, a source of traded goods and occasional raids. Your real concerns are local: the next harvest, the health of your animals, the marriage you're arranging for your eldest daughter. It's late summer, and you're working in your furthest field, the one that borders the endless grasslands to the east. The barley is almost ready for harvest, heavy with grain that whispers in the afternoon breeze. You pause to wipe sweat from your brow, and that's when you see them. Riders on the eastern horizon. This isn't unusual. Nomad groups often pass through, trading horses for grain or iron tools. But something feels different today. These riders aren't moving with the lazy confidence of traders. They're riding hard, and there are too many of them, perhaps 30 or 40. As they grow closer, you see details that make your stomach tighten. Their horses are lathered with sweat, pushed to exhaustion. The riders keep looking back over their shoulders. They thunder past your field without stopping, without even acknowledging your presence. You see their faces clearly now, and what you see there makes you grip your scythe tighter. These are Alani warriors, steppe nomads you've dealt with before, proud men who fear nothing, but their faces show naked terror. One of them, a chief by his gold arm rings, locks eyes with you for a moment as he passes. His lips move, and though you can't hear the words over the hoofbeats, you can read them clearly. Run. Run now. You stand frozen, watching the dust cloud disappear westward. The afternoon suddenly feels colder. You've never seen the Alani run from anything. What could possibly make such warriors flee? You look east, studying the horizon, but see nothing except grass moving in the wind. Yet the terror in that chief's eyes has infected you. You abandon your scythe in the field and begin walking quickly toward home. By the time you reach your house, you're running. That night, you pack everything valuable onto your wagon. Your wife thinks you've gone mad, but she sees something in your face that stops her protests. You're on the road before dawn, heading west toward the Danube, toward the Roman frontier. You're not alone. The roads are filling with others who've heard the whispers, seen the riders, felt the change in the air like animals before an earthquake. 3 days later, from the safety of the western bank of the Danube, you watch smoke rising from your abandoned village. The scouts of something new have arrived, riders unlike any you've ever seen. Their faces are broad and strange, their tactics incomprehensible. They don't occupy your village or loot it systematically. They simply destroy it and move on, like a force of nature rather than an army. You will never learn the name of the chief who warned you, or why he chose to mouth those words. But you will live to grow old, to tell your grandchildren about the day the world changed, the day the Huns arrived in Europe. Most of your neighbours weren't so fortunate. The Gothic kingdom you knew, That complex network of villages and traditions built over centuries will be gone within 3 years, its people scattered or enslaved, or recruited into the very force that destroyed them. The art of the composite bow. To understand the Huns, you must understand their bow. This wasn't merely a weapon, but a masterpiece of engineering that took 2 years to create and represented the highest achievement of steppe technology. In Roman hands, it was awkward and weak. In Hun hands, it was death itself, able to pierce armor at distances that made Roman archers weep with envy. Picture a master bowyer on the steppe beginning his work. He doesn't start with wood but with horn, specifically the horn of water buffalo or wild sheep. He heats these horns slowly over several days until they become pliable, then splits them into thin strips. These strips will form the belly of the bow, the part that faces the archer. Horn has an almost magical property. It wants to return to its original shape after being compressed. This stored energy will provide much of the bow's power. Next comes the wood. But not just any wood. The bowyer needs birch or mulberry that has grown slowly in harsh conditions, making the grain tight and resilient. This forms the bow's core, its neutral zone between opposing forces. The wood must be selected, not just for species but for specific qualities. No knots, perfectly straight grain, the right degree of moisture. A master bowyer might examine 100 trees to find one suitable piece. The third component is sinew, carefully harvested from the backs and necks of horses or deer. The bowyer pounds these sinews until they separate into individual fibers, then combs them like wool until they're aligned perfectly. These will form the bow's back, the part facing away from the archer. Sinew has the opposite property of horn. It stores energy when stretched and wants to contract back to its original length. Now comes the assembly, a process that cannot be rushed. The bowyer uses glue made from swim bladders of fish, boiled down to a consistency like honey. This glue is stronger than the materials it binds, but it requires perfect conditions to set properly. Too humid, and it never fully cures. Too dry, and it becomes brittle. The bowyer applies layer after layer, horn to wood, wood to sinew, building up a laminate that combines the best properties of each material. But the genius of the Hun bow went beyond materials. Its shape, recurved at the tips, and with a pronounced setback when unstrung, stored enormous energy. When a Hun warrior drew his bow, he was compressing horn and stretching sinew simultaneously, loading the weapon with forces trying to tear it apart. The distinctive ears at the tips of the bow acted as levers, multiplying the mechanical advantage. A bow with a draw weight of 120 pounds could launch an arrow with the force of a 160-pound English longbow, despite being half the size. The bowyer isn't finished. The completed bow must be wrapped in birch bark or leather to protect it from moisture. It needs to cure for months, slowly taking its final shape. The bowyer makes minute adjustments, testing and retesting, ensuring both limbs bend equally, that the string sits perfectly centered. He might decorate it with gold or paint, but never in ways that compromise function. The result was a weapon perfectly suited to mounted warfare, short enough to use from horseback, powerful enough to penetrate Roman mail armor, accurate enough to hit a target at full gallop. A Hun warrior didn't just carry one bow but 2 or 3, each suited for different ranges and purposes. He carried different arrows too, broadheads for unarmored targets, bodkins for penetrating armor, whistling arrows for signaling, incendiary arrows for siege warfare. Roman observers wrote in amazement and horror about Hun archery. They could loose 12 aimed arrows in a minute. They could shoot backwards at full gallop, the famous Parthian shot that gave pursuing enemies a face full of arrows. They could coordinate their fire in volleys that darkened the sky. Most terrifyingly, they started training with these weapons as children, developing muscles and instincts that no adult learner could match. This is why a relatively small number of Huns could dominate battlefields. While a Roman archer was effective to maybe 50 yards, a Hun archer was lethal at 200. While Roman cavalry had to close to sword range to fight, Hun cavalry could destroy enemies without ever coming within reach of their weapons. It wasn't just a technological advantage, but a complete revolution in how war was fought. A world in motion, the Great Migration period. To understand the Hun arrival in Europe, picture a table covered with dominoes, each one standing close to the next. The Huns didn't just invade, they pushed. And that push created a cascade that wouldn't stop for 2 centuries. The year 375 AD marks not just a Hun victory, but the beginning of what historians call the migration period, though migration seems too gentle a word for what actually happened. Before the Huns, Europe had achieved a delicate equilibrium. The Roman Empire controlled the Mediterranean world and much of Western Europe. Beyond the Rhine and Danube rivers lived various Germanic tribes: Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, Franks, Saxons, and dozens of others. Further east were Iranian-speaking peoples like the Alans and Sarmatians. Each group had found its niche, its territory, its way of dealing with Rome. Some were federates, allied to Rome in exchange for payments. Others were hostile but contained. It was a complex but stable system that had existed for generations. The Hun arrival shattered this equilibrium instantly and completely. Picture those Alani horsemen who fled past Wulfila's field. They had controlled the steppes north of the Black Sea for centuries, master horsemen in their own right. The Huns destroyed their confederation in a single campaign, killing their king and scattering the survivors. Some Alani fled west, others submitted and joined the Huns, adding their cavalry skills to an already formidable force. Next came the Goths. The Grotthungi, the eastern branch of the Gothic peoples, tried to resist. King Ermanaric, who had built a powerful kingdom stretching from the Black Sea to the Baltic, chose suicide rather than submission when he saw the futility of resistance. His successor Vithama died in battle against the Huns. Within 2 years, the Grotthungi kingdom had vanished like morning mist. The Turvingi Goths, living closer to the Roman frontier, saw what happened to their eastern cousins and made a desperate decision. In 376 AD, somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 Gothic refugees appeared on the north bank of the Danube, begging Rome for sanctuary. Men, women, children, entire communities, complete with their possessions loaded onto wagons, their cattle and sheep, their holy men carrying sacred objects. It was the ancient world's largest refugee crisis. Picture the scene at the Danube crossings. Roman officials, overwhelmed by the numbers, trying to maintain order, Gothic chieftains negotiating for their people, surrendering their weapons in exchange for permission to cross. Families separated in the chaos, children crying, the old and sick dying while waiting for their turn. Roman merchants arriving like vultures, trading dog meat for Gothic gold, selling water at extortionate prices to desperate people. The Romans, in their greed and incompetence, turned desperate allies into bitter enemies. They allowed the Goths to cross, but then failed to provide the promised food supplies. They tried to separate Gothic warriors from their families. They sold Gothic children into slavery. Within 2 years, these same Goths would destroy a Roman army at Adrianople, killing Emperor Valens himself in one of Rome's greatest military disasters. But this was just the beginning. The Huns' pressure continued, pushing more peoples westward. The Vandals abandoned their lands between the Oder and Vistula rivers, beginning a journey that would take them through Gaul, through Spain, and eventually to North Africa, where they would establish a kingdom that would plague Rome from the sea. The Burgundians moved from the Baltic coast to the Rhine. The Angles and Saxons, feeling pressure from displaced peoples behind them, began looking across the North Sea toward Britain. Each movement triggered others. When the Vandals moved west, they pushed the Suebi, When the Burgundians claimed new territory, they displaced locals who had to find somewhere else to go. It was a continental game of musical chairs, but with swords and suffering. Entire cultures were uprooted, languages disappeared, traditions centuries old were abandoned in the mud of forced marches. When empires first trembled. In the year 394 AD, a Roman ambassador named Olympiodorus prepared for a mission unlike any in his long diplomatic career. He had negotiated with Persian satraps and Germanic kings, but this was different. He was being sent to meet the Huns, and nobody in Constantinople really knew what that meant. Olympiodorus was not a brave man by nature. He was a scholar who had risen through the imperial bureaucracy by being careful, thoughtful, and very good at languages. He spoke Greek, Latin, Gothic, and Persian. He had spent weeks trying to find anyone who could teach him even basic Hunnic phrases, but found only fragments, words borrowed by Goths who had fled westward. The language seemed to belong to no family he knew, neither Germanic nor Iranian, neither Turkic nor Mongolic, or perhaps elements of all of them. The journey to the Hun encampment took 3 weeks through increasingly empty lands, villages abandoned, fields returning to wilderness, roads disappearing under grass. His Gothic guides grew more nervous with each day, speaking in whispers, starting at every unexpected sound. They told stories around the campfires, stories of Hun warriors who could shoot a bird from the sky at full gallop, who drank blood and ate raw meat, who were born on horseback and died on horseback. When Olympiodorus finally saw the Hun camp, his first thought was that it didn't look like a camp at all. Roman military camps were orderly, square, with streets at right angles and designated areas for different functions. This was more like a vast sprawl of tents and wagons arranged in clusters, with herds of horses everywhere, more horses than he had ever seen in one place. The smell hit him from a mile away. Horses, smoke, leather, and something else. Fermented mare's milk that the Huns drank like wine. The Huns who met him looked nothing like the monsters described by Gothic refugees. They were shorter than Romans, yes, with faces broader and flatter than Europeans. But they were just men. Some had artificially deformed skulls, elongated in childhood by binding, which gave them an alien appearance. But their eyes were intelligent, calculating, amused by his obvious fear. The Hun chief who received him, a man named Uldin, conducted negotiations from horseback. This wasn't an insult, but simply how Hun leaders did business. Uldin spoke through a Gothic translator, though Olympiodorus suspected the chief understood more Latin than he let on. The demands were straightforward: annual tribute in gold, trading rights, and recognition as equals to Rome. In exchange, the Huns would not raid Roman territory and would provide military assistance when requested. What struck Olympiodorus most forcefully was the Hun attitude toward Rome. They weren't awed by Roman power or civilization. They saw Rome as simply another source of wealth to be exploited, like a particularly rich grazing ground. When Olympiodorus tried to impress them with descriptions of Constantinople's walls and armies, Uldin laughed and pointed to a bird flying overhead. "If we wanted to," he said through the translator, "we could shoot that bird down. If we wanted to, we could bring down your walls just as easily." The negotiation succeeded. After a fashion, Olympiodorus agreed to most demands. Knowing the alternative was worse, as he prepared to leave, Uldin gave him a gift, a Hun bow. "Tell your emperor," Uldin said, "that this is just one bow. We have 10,000 like it, and 10,000 men who know how to use them better than your best archer on his finest day. Living ghosts, what the archaeological record reveals." In the pre-dawn darkness of the Hungarian plains, archaeologist Esther Kovacs kneels beside an excavation that shouldn't exist. It's the summer of 2010, and her team has discovered something that challenges everything we thought we knew about Hun settlements, or rather, their supposed absence. Here, carefully preserved in the soil, are the remains of a Hun period village, complete with workshops, storage facilities, and evidence of long-term occupation, the Huns left us a paradox in the ground. A people who controlled vast territories for nearly a century left fewer archaeological traces than cultures that existed for just a few decades. But what we do find tells a story more complex than the barbaric horsemen of Roman propaganda. Consider the cauldrons. Throughout the Hungarian plains and surrounding regions, archaeologists have discovered massive bronze cauldrons, some weighing over 40 pounds. These weren't portable camping equipment, but ceremonial objects, decorated with mushroom-shaped handles and geometric patterns. The metallurgy required to create them indicates sophisticated techniques and probably permanent workshops. You can stand before one of these cauldrons in the Hungarian National Museum and feel the weight of questions. Who commissioned them? What ceremonies required vessels that could hold enough stew for 100 people? Why did a supposedly nomadic people need such heavy, impractical objects? The burials tell another story. Hun graves are rare, but when found, they speak of a culture obsessed with status and the afterlife. Warriors were buried with their horses, sometimes 3 or 4 mounts killed to accompany their master. Their composite bows, those technological marvels, were broken and placed in the grave, destroyed to serve in the next world. Gold and silver ornaments, many showing influences from across Asia and Europe, demonstrate vast trade networks and cultural exchanges. One grave, discovered near Szeged, contained something extraordinary: a diadem, a crown of gold and garnets that wouldn't look out of place on a Roman emperor. But the craftsmanship shows multiple influences: Roman goldsmithing techniques, Germanic decorative patterns, and Central Asian symbolic elements. This wasn't the crown of a barbarian warlord, but of someone who saw himself as heir to multiple traditions, a ruler of a multicultural empire. Then there's the mystery of the modified skulls. In perhaps a quarter of Hun burials, the skulls show artificial cranial deformation, achieved by binding the head in infancy to create an elongated shape. This practice, found from the Caucasus to Central Asia, marks someone as aristocracy from birth. The message was clear: we are different from you, marked by the gods, shaped for rule. But it's what we don't find that's most telling. No Hun cities, no monuments, no inscriptions in their own language. They built in wood and felt, materials that return to the earth within a generation. They wrote their laws in memory, not stone. They measured wealth in horses and followers, not buildings. When they disappeared, they left only shadows in the archaeological record, negative space where a civilization should be, the tongue that left no words. Listen to these words spoken aloud: Strava, Medos, Kamos. These are among the only certain Hunnic words to survive, preserved by accident in Roman accounts. Strava, a funeral feast. Medos, a honey drink, probably mead. Kamos, a barley drink. We know what the Huns drank at funerals, but we don't know how they said mother, or love, or home. The mystery of the Hunnic language haunts historians like a ghost that refuses to be laid to rest. Here was a people who dominated Europe for decades, who negotiated with emperors, who commanded multi-ethnic armies, requiring complex communication, yet their language vanished almost without trace. How is this possible? Priscus, a Roman diplomat who visited Attila's court, provides our best glimpse into the linguistic chaos of the Hun Empire. He describes a banquet where Hunnic, Gothic, Latin, and Greek were all spoken, sometimes in the same conversation. Attila himself, Priscus notes with surprise, understood Latin perfectly, but chose to speak only Hunnic, requiring everything to be translated. This wasn't ignorance, but a power play, forcing Roman ambassadors to wait for translations, making them dependent on interpreters who might, or might not, convey subtle meanings. The few Hunnic words and names that survive come filtered through Greek and Latin writers, who had no letters for sounds that didn't exist in their languages. Imagine trying to write Mandarin Chinese using only the English alphabet without tone marks, and you begin to understand the problem. The name Attila itself might be Gothic, meaning little father, or it might be Hunnic, twisted beyond recognition by Roman tongues and Roman scribes. Some scholars argue Hunnic was Turkic, pointing to names that seem to have Turkic roots. Others see similarities to Mongolic languages. Still others suggest it was a unique language, now extinct, perhaps related to the Yeniseian languages of Siberia. The most intriguing theory connects the Huns to the Xiongnu, who troubled China for centuries before disappearing westward at exactly the right time to emerge as the Huns in Europe. But the linguistic evidence is like trying to reconstruct a symphony from 3 random notes. What we do know is how the loss happened. The Huns didn't value writing in their own language. They used literate subject peoples as scribes when needed, conducting official business in Gothic or Latin. When their empire collapsed after Attila's death, the Hun people were absorbed into other populations. Within 2 generations, nobody alive remembered how to speak pure Hunnic. The children of Hun warriors grew up speaking Gothic or Gepid or Frankish, and their children's children didn't even know their grandfathers had once made Rome tremble. There's a peculiar sadness to standing in a museum, looking at Hun artifacts, magnificent goldwork, weapons of superb craftsmanship, and realizing we don't know what the creators called these objects. We don't know their songs, their prayers, their jokes, their terms of endearment, an entire human experience, the inner life of a culture lost forever. The Huns left us their victims' fear, their enemies' propaganda, and their abandoned grave goods. But their voices, their actual voices, are gone. In the end, the people who brought down the Roman Empire's greatest armies were themselves conquered by silence, defeated by the simple passage of time and the absence of written words. They remain the ghosts who shaped Europe, the thunder whose echo we can still hear, but whose original sound is lost forever. Brothers in shadow, Bleda and Attila. The year is 434 AD, and 2 brothers stand on opposite sides of a fresh grave. Their uncle Rua, king of the Huns, lies beneath the disturbed earth, dead from what the Romans claim was divine intervention, a lightning strike sent by their god to protect Constantinople. Bleda and Attila know better. They know their uncle died choking on his own blood after a night of heavy drinking, but they're happy to let the Romans believe their comfortable myth. The brothers could not be more different. Bleda, the elder by 3 years, stands tall and broad, built like the warriors of old stories. He laughs easily, drinks heavily, and leads through charm and generosity. Warriors love him because he remembers their names, their victories, their fathers' names. He rules from the saddle, in the traditional way, moving with his people across the grasslands, maintaining the ancient customs. Attila is smaller, quieter, with eyes that never seem to blink quite enough. Where Bleda jokes, Attila calculates. Where Bleda drinks, Attila watches. He spent 5 years as a hostage in the Roman court at Ravenna, learning Latin, studying Roman administration, observing how empires actually function. He came back changed, speaking of permanent capitals, of written laws, of taxation systems that could extract wealth without destroying its source. For 12 years, these brothers rule together, an arrangement that surprises everyone by not immediately ending in bloodshed. They divide their responsibilities. Bleda manages the traditional Hun nobility, keeps the subject tribes in line through personal relationships and occasional demonstrations of force. Attila handles negotiations with Rome, extracting ever-increasing tributes, turning Roman gold into Hun power. Picture them in council, surrounded by chiefs who owe allegiance to one brother or the other, or cleverly, to both. Bleda argues for the old ways. Raid, plunder, move on. Let the grasslands heal, return in a generation to raid again. It's worked for centuries. Why change? Attila speaks of something different, An empire that doesn't just raid Rome but replaces it, that doesn't just steal gold, but controls its production. The subject peoples, Goths, Gepids, Alans, Rugians, watch this brother dance with interest and calculation. They send gifts to both brothers, careful never to favour one too openly. They know what everyone knows, but nobody says. This arrangement cannot last. The Hun confederation is growing too powerful, too complex, to be ruled by committee. The question isn't whether the brothers will clash, but when, and who will survive. In 445 AD, Bleda goes hunting in the marshes near the Tisza River. He takes only a small retinue, his most trusted men. They never return. Attila announces his brother's tragic death, killed by a wild boar, a warrior's end. He gives Bleda a magnificent funeral, the strava lasting 3 days. Enough kumis and mead flowing to float a ship. Warriors race their horses around the burial mound until the ground is packed harder than stone. Attila weeps publicly, dramatically, his grief so profound that even those who suspect the truth begin to doubt. But those who knew both brothers see the changes immediately. The easy laughter disappears from the royal camp, where Bleda held court in the open, surrounded by warriors and wine. Attila retreats to wooden halls, surrounded by secretaries and interpreters. Where Bleda led raids for glory and plunder, Attila launches campaigns with the methodical precision of a Roman general. The Hun confederation stops being a confederation and starts becoming an empire, and at its heart sits one man, alone, calculating, unblinking. The transformation is complete within a year. Chiefs who had been kings of their own peoples now kneel before Attila's wooden throne. The title they use for him isn't Hun but Gothic. Attila, little father. But there's nothing paternal about his rule. He is judge, general, and god-king rolled into one. When he walks through his camp, conversations stop. When he speaks, no one else moves. He has become what no Hun leader before him had ever been, an emperor. The price of Roman gold, 7 tons of gold. That's what Constantinople agrees to pay Attila in 443 AD, after he threatens to turn the Eastern Roman Empire into grasslands suitable for horses. 7 tons, plus an annual tribute of £2,100 of gold. To put this in perspective, the entire annual revenue of a prosperous Roman city might be £50 of gold. Attila is extracting the equivalent of 40 cities' wealth every single year. How did it come to this? How did the empire that once made the Mediterranean a Roman lake end up paying protection money, like a shopkeeper bribing the local gang? The answer lies not in military weakness, but in a fatal calculation. It was cheaper to pay the Huns than to fight them. Consider the mathematics of 4th century warfare. Maintaining a legion of 6,000 men cost approximately £25 of gold per year in wages alone. Add supplies, equipment, fortifications, and you're looking at £50 annually. A single major campaign involving multiple legions could cost £1,000 of gold. But here's the crucial detail that assumes you win. If you lose, you've spent the gold and still have to pay tribute, except now from a position of weakness, with fewer soldiers and damaged prestige. The Romans learned this lesson at the Battle of the Utus River in 442 AD. They assembled an army of 30,000 men, spent £200 of gold just moving them into position, and then watched Attila's horse archers turn their proud formations into pincushions. The survivors fled behind the walls of Constantinople, and the emperor's negotiators found themselves agreeing to terms that would have seemed like madness a generation earlier. But Attila understood something deeper about the Roman economy. The gold he extracted didn't just weaken Rome financially, it created a systemic dependency. Picture the imperial tax collectors spreading across the Eastern Empire, demanding special levies to pay the Hun tribute. Farmers who can barely feed themselves are forced to sell their seed grain. Merchants face confiscatory taxes that destroy trade routes. Towns that had maintained themselves for centuries begin to empty as residents flee the tax burden. Meanwhile, that same gold transforms Hun society. Attila doesn't hoard it in treasury vaults. He distributes it to his chiefs, binding them with golden chains stronger than any oath. A Gothic prince who might have resisted Hun domination finds himself wearing Roman gold, drinking from Roman silver cups, his loyalty purchased with Roman wealth. The gold flows through the Hun Empire like blood through veins, creating dependencies, obligations, and hierarchies. The Romans try to be clever. They send embassy after embassy, trying to negotiate better terms, to play different Hun chiefs against each other. Attila receives them in a calculated display of power and contempt. The Roman ambassadors, used to marble palaces and elaborate protocols, find themselves meeting the most powerful man in Europe in a wooden hall. Sitting on cushions on the floor, while Attila lounges on a couch, eating plain food from wooden plates, while his guests are served delicacies on silver. The message is clear. I don't need your luxury. I take your gold, not because I desire it, but because taking it weakens you and strengthens me. Every pound of gold you send acknowledges that I am master and you are slave. The tribute isn't just payment, it's submission, ritualized in yellow metal. One Roman ambassador, Priscus, records a conversation with a Roman merchant who had been captured and chose to stay with the Huns rather than accept ransom. Among the Huns, the merchant explains, I am free. I pay no taxes except my service in war. I keep what I earn. I speak my mind without fear. In Rome, I was crushed by taxes, tangled in lawsuits, afraid of officials who could destroy me with a word. Tell me, which is the civilized life? The gold tribute reaches its peak in 447 AD, £12,000 in back payments, plus an agreement to triple the annual tribute. The Eastern Roman Empire is essentially working for Attila now, its entire taxation system oriented toward feeding his treasury. Roman soldiers go unpaid, so Attila's warriors can wear Roman gold. Roman walls crumble so Hun nobles can drink from Roman silver, yet perversely, this system maintains a kind of peace. As long as the gold flows, Attila doesn't raid Roman territory. Roman merchants can trade across Hun lands. Roman ambassadors are received with courtesy, if not respect. It's a protection racket, elevated to international diplomacy, and it works. After a fashion, until Attila decides that gold alone is no longer enough. Walking through Attila's camp, you are Anatolius, secretary to the Roman ambassador Maximinus, and it is spring of 449 AD. You have travelled for 3 weeks from Constantinople, through lands that were once Roman but now acknowledge only one master. Your mission is delicate, to negotiate modifications to the tribute agreement, and secretly, though you don't know this, your ambassador has been tasked with arranging Attila's assassination. You know only that you must observe everything, remember everything, record everything. The Hun capital, if it can be called that, spreads across the Hungarian plain like a vast nomad camp that forgot to move. There are no walls, no defensive structures that you can see, just an endless sprawl of tents, wooden buildings, and wagons. The smell reaches you before you can see details. Horses, thousands upon thousands of horses, their scent mixing with smoke from countless fires, the acidic tang of fermented mare's milk, and something else, the distinct smell of a settlement that moves too often to worry about sanitation. Your Gothic guide leads you through the outer districts first. Here live the subject peoples, Gepids, Rugians, Sarmatians, even some Romans who have thrown their lot in with the Huns. Their dwellings are permanent, wooden houses with small gardens, an attempt at the settled life they once knew. Children play in the muddy streets, stopping to stare at your Roman clothes, your clean-shaven face, markers of a world they've heard about but never seen. As you move inward, the character changes. The tents grow larger, more elaborate. You see Hun nobles, distinguishable by their artificially elongated skulls, their clothes heavy with Roman gold, transformed into barbaric ornaments. They don't walk, they ride, even for distances of 100 yards. Their horses are small, ugly by Roman standards, but they move with a nervous energy that makes your own mount seem sluggish. You pass a training ground where boys who can't be more than 7 years old are practicing archery from horseback. Their instructor, a scarred warrior, missing his left eye, has them riding at full gallop, both hands on their bows, controlling their mounts with knees alone. When one boy falls, the instructor doesn't help him up, doesn't even look. The boy remounts, blood streaming from his nose, and continues the exercise. The sound of hammering draws you to a smith's quarter. Here, Gothic craftsmen work Roman gold into Hun designs, twisted torques, eagle-headed brooches, belt buckles that would cost a Roman soldier a year's wages. You watch one smith carefully inlaying garnets into a sword pommel, creating patterns that seem to shift in the firelight. This isn't barbarian craftsmanship, but a fusion of traditions, creating something entirely new. Finally, you reach the centre, Attila's compound. It's surrounded not by walls but by a wooden colonnade, open but somehow forbidding. The main hall is enormous, built of polished wood that must have come from far to the north. Its roof is steep, almost church-like, though no cross adorns its peak. Instead, there's a golden eagle, or perhaps a falcon. It's hard to tell from the ground. You're made to wait. Of course, power waits for no one. You spend 3 hours standing in an anteroom, watching the business of empire. Scribes writing in languages you don't recognize, using scripts that might be Greek or Latin or something else entirely. Chiefs arriving from distant corners of Attila's domain, each with tribute. Furs from the north, amber from the Baltic, slaves from who knows where. When you're finally admitted to the Great Hall, the contrast with Constantinople's throne room couldn't be starker. No marble, no mosaics, no purple silk. The hall is dark, lit by fires in iron braziers that cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls. At the far end, on a raised platform, sits a couch, not a throne, a couch, as if Attila is simply relaxing in his home rather than ruling half of Europe. The man himself is smaller than you expected. After all the stories, you anticipated a giant. Instead, you see a compact man with a large head, deep-set eyes that rarely blink, and a sparse beard going grey. He wears plain clothes, no gold, no ornaments except a single ring, while his chiefs glitter with Roman treasure. He seems to deliberately dress like a common warrior. The audience is theatre, you realise. Attila speaks only Hunnic, though you're certain he understands every word of Latin and Greek spoken in his presence. Everything must be translated, creating pauses that he uses to study faces, to let tension build. When he does speak, his voice is quiet, forcing everyone to lean forward, to hang on each word. The women history forgot. History remembers Attila's wives as numbers, not names. 12 wives, the chronicles say, though some sources claim more. But these weren't just wives. They were diplomatic treaties in human form. Each marriage an alliance, a conquered people bound to Attila through the most ancient of chains, blood and children. The first wife whose name survives is Kreka, or Hereka, in the Gothic spelling. She was likely Gepid royalty, married to Attila early in his reign when the Gepids still needed convincing to join the Hun confederation. Kreka managed Attila's household, a task that meant coordinating the domestic lives of thousands. The other wives, the concubines, the children, the servants, the slaves. She was, in effect, the prime minister of a mobile city. Priscus, our invaluable Roman observer, met Kreka and left us a remarkable portrait. She received the Roman embassy in her own hall, surrounded by servant women working elaborate embroidery on linen that would become gifts, diplomatic tools as important as any treaty. She spoke through interpreters but clearly understood Greek, occasionally smiling at comments before they were translated, catching lies and evasions that her husband might miss or choose to ignore. But the most intriguing woman in this story never married Attila at all. Justa Grata Honoria, sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, sent Attila a ring and a plea for rescue in the spring of 450 AD. At 32, Honoria was being forced into marriage with an elderly senator, punishment for an affair with her steward. In desperation, she turned to the one man in Europe powerful enough to defy her brother. Attila chose to interpret Honoria's plea as a marriage proposal and her ring as a betrothal gift. He demanded half the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. When Valentinian refused, Attila had his casus belli, his reason for war wrapped in the language of romance and honour. Whether he actually intended to marry Honoria or simply used her as a pretext remains one of history's mysteries. Consider the audacity of Honoria's gambit. A Roman princess, raised in marble palaces, educated in Greek philosophy and Christian theology, appealing to a pagan warlord who already had a dozen wives. She was willing to trade everything she had known for freedom from her brother's control. What does that tell us about the lives of even the most privileged Roman women? The Hun women themselves remain largely invisible in our sources, mentioned only when they intersect with Roman anxieties. We know Hun women could own property, including slaves and herds. We know they rode horses, though whether they fought in battle remains debated. Archaeological evidence shows Hun women buried with weapons, but whether these were symbolic or practical remains unknown. There's one extraordinary account of Hun women at war. During a battle with the Goths, when the Hun men were being pushed back, the women emerged from the wagon camp, not to fight, but to shame their men into greater efforts. They bared their breasts and asked if the warriors wanted to retreat back into the wombs they came from. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The Hun warriors turned back to battle with desperate fury rather than face such humiliation. The most famous Hun woman is also the most mysterious. Ildiko, the last bride. She was probably Gothic, definitely young, certainly beautiful enough to catch Attila's eye, even after decades of political marriages. On their wedding night in 453 AD, something went catastrophically wrong. The next morning, Attila was dead, and Ildiko was found weeping over his body, her clothes soaked in blood. Sunset at Margus. Marcus Aurelius Cassianus had been the chief customs officer at Margus for 23 years. It was, he often reflected, the perfect position for a man of modest ambition and flexible ethics. The city sat on the Danube, right at the border between the Roman Empire and Hun territory, which meant every trader, ambassador, and spy passed through his inspection post. The summer of 441 AD had been particularly profitable. The treaty between Constantinople and the Huns meant regular trade, and regular trade meant regular bribes. Marcus had just finished counting his take for the day, 43 silver siliqui, enough to buy that vineyard he'd been eyeing, when he noticed the dust cloud on the northern horizon. Trading caravans raised dust, certainly, but not like this. This was the dust of an army, and it was coming fast. Marcus climbed the watchtower, his knees protesting the effort, and what he saw made his blood turn to ice water. Hun cavalry, thousands of them, spreading across the plain like spilled wine across a table. The bishop had warned this would happen. Some fool had robbed Hun graves across the river, stealing gold offerings left for dead chiefs. The Huns demanded the thieves be surrendered. The bishop, an ambitious man who confused righteousness with stubbornness, had refused. "We don't surrender Romans to barbarians," he had declared from his pulpit. Marcus wondered if the bishop still felt so righteous now, watching the same dust cloud from his church tower. The siege, if it could be called that, lasted exactly 3 days. Margus had walls, good Roman walls that had stood for 2 centuries, but they were built to withstand Gothic raids, not a serious assault. The Huns didn't even bother with a direct attack at first. They simply surrounded the city and waited, letting panic do their work for them. On the second day, they brought up their siege equipment, not the crude rams and ladders Marcus expected, but sophisticated Roman devices, catapults, and ballistae, operated by Roman engineers who had changed sides for gold or survival. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Roman machines in barbarian hands, breaking Roman walls. On the third day, as the walls began to crack, the bishop tried to negotiate. He came to the walls wearing his finest robes, carrying a golden cross that caught the evening light. He offered gold, slaves, anything except the grave robbers, who had probably fled days ago anyway. The Hun commander listened patiently, then had his archers put 3 arrows through the bishop's chest. The body fell from the walls into the river, the golden cross following with a splash that Marcus could hear from his hiding place in the customs house cellar. The city fell as the sun set, painting everything red, though soon enough there was real red to replace the sunset's illusion. Marcus watched through a crack in the cellar floor as Hun warriors moved through his city with terrible efficiency. They weren't randomly looting. They had lists, maps, information about where the wealth was hidden. Someone had sold Margus's secrets long before the first Hun appeared on the horizon. By midnight, Margus was burning. The Huns were taking everything valuable and destroying the rest. Not from mindless barbarism, Marcus realized, but from calculated policy. Margus would never again serve as a Roman strongpoint on the Danube. The customs house, where Marcus had grown comfortable and corrupt, was now ash and memory. The vineyard he'd hoped to buy would grow wild, untended, its potential wine never tasted. The machinery of terror. Terror is a tool, and the Huns wielded it with the precision of master craftsmen. They didn't simply defeat enemies. They created stories that travelled faster than their horses, stories that opened city gates before the first arrow was fired. Understanding how they did this means understanding that the Huns were not mindless destroyers, but sophisticated practitioners of psychological warfare. Consider their tactical approach to siege warfare. When approaching a fortified city, the Huns didn't immediately attack. They would camp just out of arrow range and begin a careful choreography of intimidation. First came the horse races, thousands of riders galloping around the city walls, raising dust clouds that blocked the sun, the thunder of hooves, creating a constant drumbeat of anxiety. The races would continue day and night, riders replacing each other in shifts, never allowing the defenders a moment of quiet. Next came the archery displays. Hun warriors would ride past the walls at full gallop, shooting arrows not at the defenders, but at targets they'd set up. Displaying inhuman accuracy, they'd shoot birds from the sky, hit melons thrown in the air, put arrows through rings hanging from poles. The message was clear. When we decide to kill you, you cannot hide, you cannot run, you cannot survive. Then came the calculated cruelty. If the Huns captured locals from surrounding villages, they wouldn't immediately kill them. They would build scaffolds in full view of the city walls and conduct slow, public executions. But here's the crucial detail. They would always leave one survivor, mutilated but alive, to run to the city gates and describe what awaited those who resisted. The survivor was part of the weapon, a living message of horror. The Huns understood that cities are held together by social bonds, and they deliberately targeted these bonds. They would offer generous terms to any who opened the gates, not just survival but wealth, position in the Hun hierarchy, protection from future raids. But the offer came with a timer. Each day the terms grew worse. By the third day, only the gate openers would be spared. By the 5th day, not even them. This created faction and suspicion within the besieged city, defenders watching each other as carefully as they watched the Huns. Their reputation preceded them like an advance guard, Stories spread of cities that resisted and were erased so completely that travellers couldn't find where they had stood. These stories grew in the telling, each iteration adding new horrors. The Huns didn't discourage these exaggerations. A reputation for supernatural cruelty was worth 10,000 warriors. But the Huns also understood the value of mercy, strategically applied. Cities that surrendered immediately were often treated well, their populations left intact, their walls undemolished. These cities became advertisements for submission, living proof that cooperation with the Huns meant survival. Roman observers were baffled by this inconsistency, not understanding that the randomness was the point. If you couldn't predict whether resistance meant death or mere slavery, whether surrender meant safety or massacre, the only rational choice was immediate, complete submission. The Hun army itself was a weapon of terror. Unlike Roman armies with their standardized equipment and formations, Hun forces were deliberately chaotic in appearance. Warriors from a dozen different peoples, wearing different armor, carrying different weapons, united only by their service to Attila. To Roman eyes, accustomed to ordered legions, this looked like chaos, but it was organized chaos. Each ethnic contingent with its specific role, its specific terror to contribute. The speed of Hun operations added another layer of psychological pressure. Roman armies moved at 15 miles per day on good roads. Hun forces could cover 50 miles per day across any terrain. A city might receive word that the Huns were 300 miles away and feel safe, only to find them at the gates 48 hours later. This compression of time and space made traditional defensive strategies useless. By the time you heard the Huns were coming, they had already arrived. Strange bedfellows, the Gothic-Hun alliance. In 448 AD, in a wooden hall somewhere on the Hungarian plains, two men who should have been mortal enemies shared a drinking horn filled with kumis. Valamir, king of the Ostrogoths, and Attila, king of the Huns, were finalizing an alliance that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. The Goths, who had fled the Huns in terror 70 years before, were now their most important military partners. How did this transformation happen? The answer lies in the pragmatic brutality of 5th century politics and the unexpected compatibility between Gothic and Hun military systems. The Goths brought heavy infantry and siege expertise. The Huns provided light cavalry and strategic mobility. Together, they formed a combined arms force that could defeat any army in Europe. The alliance began with individual Gothic warriors joining Hun raids for plunder. These weren't traitors to their people, but younger sons, landless men, adventurers who saw opportunity in Attila's meritocratic system. In Hun service, a capable Gothic warrior could rise higher than Gothic society would ever allow. Some became generals, leading mixed forces of Huns, Goths, and others. They brought Roman military knowledge, having served as foederati, allied troops, in Roman armies. Valamir himself had started as one of these adventurers. He had ridden with Attila's uncle Rua, proved himself in raids against the Eastern Empire, and gradually gathered a following of both Goths and Huns. When the old Ostrogothic royal line died out, Valamir was positioned to claim leadership, but his authority rested on Hun support. He was king of the Ostrogoths, but also Attila's sworn man, a dual loyalty that would have been unthinkable in the old tribal system. The relationship wasn't simply military. Gothic craftsmen became essential to the Hun economy, producing the weapons and armor that Hun warriors needed but couldn't make themselves. Gothic farmers provided grain that supplemented the Hun pastoral diet. Gothic scribes, literate in Latin and Greek, handled diplomatic correspondence with Rome. The Huns, in turn, provided protection and access to the vast trading networks of the steppe. Intermarriage sealed these alliances. Hun nobles took Gothic wives, Gothic chiefs married Hun princesses. The children of these unions were something new, equally comfortable on horseback or behind a shield wall, speaking both languages, claiming both heritages. They were the future that might have been had Attila's empire survived. The Gothic-Hun alliance reached its apex during the invasion of Gaul in 451 AD. Gothic infantry formed the centre of Attila's battle line at the Catalonian fields, standing firm against Roman and Visigothic attacks, while Hun cavalry harassed the flanks. When the Gothic king Theodoric fell in battle, his sons didn't break alliance with Attila. They understood that their fate was now bound to his success. But this alliance also contained the seeds of its own destruction. As Goths gained prominence in Attila's system, traditional Hun nobles grew resentful. As Gothic culture influenced Hun practices, some Huns feared losing their identity. The fusion that made the alliance militarily powerful also created internal tensions that would explode after Attila's death. Breathing before the storm. The spring of 451 AD brought an unusual quiet to Gaul. In the markets of Orleans, merchants noticed that Eastern traders had stopped coming. In the fields around Chalons, farmers reported that birds were migrating early, great flocks heading west as if fleeing something. In the monasteries, monks copying manuscripts found their hands trembling for no reason they could name. Flavius Aetius, the supreme military commander of the Western Roman Empire, stood on the walls of Metz, watching the eastern horizon. He had spent 30 years fighting to preserve what remained of Rome in Gaul, making alliances with barbarians to fight other barbarians, playing Gothic ambitions against Frankish aggression, Burgundian pride against Saxon hunger. He had been, everyone agreed, remarkably successful. Gaul still functioned, still sent taxes to Ravenna, still maintained the fiction of Roman order. But this was different. His spies, what few remained alive, brought reports that defied belief. Attila wasn't bringing a raiding force, or even an army. He was bringing a migration, hundreds of thousands strong, Huns, Goths, Gepids, Rugians, Thuringians, Siri, even Burgundians, who had chosen Attila over their own kinsmen. It wasn't an invasion, it was a reshaping of the world's ethnic map. In the great forest of the Ardennes, Frankish scouts watched endless columns passing on the Roman roads below. Warriors, certainly, but also wagons loaded with dismantled homes, herds of cattle and sheep, women and children. The Franks had planned to ambush the Hun vanguard, take plunder, and fade back into the forest. But you don't ambush a nation in motion, you either join it or get out of its way. The city of Cologne fell so quietly that refugees arriving in Mainz couldn't say exactly how it happened. One day Roman officials were collecting taxes. The next day Hun administrators were doing the same job, using the same lists, in the same offices. The only difference was that the gold now flowed east instead of south. In Paris, Bishop Genevieve led prayers that grew more fervent with each passing day. She promised the citizens that God would protect them if they showed sufficient faith. Privately, she also organized the hiding of church treasure and the quiet evacuation of those too old or young to survive a siege. Faith, she believed, worked best when paired with practical preparation. The Roman Senate, safely distant in Rome itself, debated whether this was really their problem. Gaul was far away, separated by the Alps, defended by Aetius, who had never failed before. Some senators, those with estates in Africa and Sicily, quietly suggested that losing Gaul might not be catastrophic. The empire had survived the loss of Britain. It could survive this too, but Aetius knew better. He had spent his youth as a hostage among the Huns, had learned their language, their tactics, their dreams. He knew Attila, had hunted with him, shared kumis around campfires, listened to his plans for remaking the world. This invasion wasn't about plunder or even conquest. It was about replacement. Attila intended to create a new empire on Roman foundations, using Roman systems, but with Hun leadership. The Catalonian fields, where worlds collided. The battle that saved Western civilization, or destroyed it, depending on your perspective. began with a mistake. On June 20th, 451 AD, a Hun scouting force stumbled into a Frankish foraging party in the rolling hills near Chalons. Neither group was looking for a fight, but once blood was drawn, the machinery of war that had been grinding slowly toward this moment suddenly accelerated into inevitable collision. Picture the Catalonian fields that morning, not a single battlefield, but a series of ridges and valleys stretching for miles, covered with ripening wheat that would never be harvested. The Roman alliance held the high ground. Aetius's legions in the centre, Visigothic heavy cavalry on the right, Frankish infantry on the left, with Saxons, Alans, and Burgundians filling the gaps. Perhaps 150,000 men, the last great gathering of Roman military might. Across the valley, Attila's host spread like a dark sea, Huns on the flanks, their horses nervous and stamping, sensing the violence to come. Ostrogothic infantry in the centre, their shields locked, their king Valamir riding along their front, reminding them of Gothic glory. Gepids, Rugians, Thuringians, each ethnic group maintaining its own formation, its own pride, united only by fear and respect for the small man watching from a distant hilltop. The battle began at dawn with the ancient ritual of single combat. Champions rode into the space between armies, shouting challenges, performing feats of horsemanship and weapons skill. A young Visigothic prince killed a Hun champion with a thrown spear, and the Visigothic line erupted in cheers. A Gepid warrior cut down 2 Frankish challengers in succession before a Roman officer put a pilum through his chest. These individual deaths were meaningless to the outcome but essential to morale, each army taking the measure of its enemy. Then Attila gave the signal, a black banner raised on a long pole, and hell came to the Catalonian fields. The Hun cavalry swept forward on both flanks simultaneously, thousands of arrows darkening the sky. The Roman alliance had prepared for this, their men carrying large shields, but the sheer volume of arrows was overwhelming. Men fell with shafts in their eyes, their throats, the gaps in their armour. Horses screamed and thrashed, their riders crushed beneath them. But Aetius had learned from decades of fighting Huns. His troops didn't break formation, didn't chase the retreating horse archers. They held their ground, absorbed the arrow storm, and waited. When the Hun cavalry wheeled to make another pass, they found Roman cavalry reserves charging from concealed positions, forcing them into close combat, where their bows were useless. The centre became a grinding horror. Ostrogothic infantry crashed into Roman legions, and suddenly it was like the old days, when Rome fought Germanic tribes for the fate of the world. But these weren't the wild charges of ancient times. Both sides fought with disciplined precision, formations holding even as men fell, reserves moving up to fill gaps. The killing was methodical, almost industrial, in its efficiency. King Theodoric of the Visigoths led a charge that should have broken the Hun left flank. His heavy cavalry smashed through the first line, the second, driving deep into Attila's formation. For a moment, it seemed the battle might end quickly. Then Theodoric fell, some say to a Hun arrow, others claim trampled by his own men in the press. His death should have broken Visigothic morale, but his son Thorismund seized his father's banner and led an even more furious charge, driven by rage and grief. As the sun reached its zenith, the battle had become a formless melee, all strategy abandoned. Romans fought Goths who had served alongside them the year before. Huns killed other Huns who had chosen different sides. Brothers faced brothers, fathers faced sons. The complex web of intermarriage and alliance that had held the post-Roman world together, now tearing itself apart. Attila, watching his centre begin to buckle, prepared for defeat with characteristic pragmatism. He ordered a great pyre, built of wagon frames and saddles, declaring he would burn himself rather than be captured. But as evening approached, neither side had achieved clear victory. The dead covered the fields so thickly that cavalry charges became impossible. Exhaustion, not victory, ended the fighting. The numbers vary depending on the source, but all agree this was among the bloodiest days in ancient history. Perhaps 100,000 dead, wounded beyond counting. The Catalonian fields became a charnel ground, the smell carrying for miles, drawing wolves and ravens from across Gaul. Neither side could claim victory. Both armies withdrew, leaving the dead unburied, the wounded to die in the summer heat. Aetius and Attila, the last Romans. 3 days after the Catalonian fields, in the neutral ground between the two battered armies, Flavius Aetius and Attila met under a flag of truce. They came with minimal escort, two men who had shaped the 5th century, now deciding how it would end. They had known each other for 30 years, since Aetius had been a teenage hostage among the Huns, and Attila had been a young prince learning the art of power. They spoke in Hunnic, a language that excluded their interpreters and guards, creating a bubble of privacy in the midst of 100,000 armed men. What they said was never recorded, but the outcome was clear. Attila would withdraw from Gaul, Aetius would not pursue. The Western Roman Empire would survive, but only barely. The Hun Empire would remain intact, but its westward expansion was finished. Later, historians would puzzle over this decision. Why did Aetius allow Attila to escape when one more battle might have destroyed him? Why did Attila retreat when Aetius's alliance was already fragmenting? The Visigoths leaving with their dead king, the Franks melting back into their forests? The answer perhaps lies in what these two men represented, the last generation that remembered the old world and understood that what came next would be unrecognisably different. Aetius was called the last of the Romans, but in truth, he was more Germanic than Roman. He had spent his youth among barbarians, commanded barbarian armies, married a Gothic princess. He spoke better Gothic than Latin, understood tribal politics better than Senate procedures. He fought for Rome not out of patriotism, but because Rome was the structure that gave his life meaning. Without the empire, he was just another warlord in an age that would have too many. Attila, for his part, was more Roman than he admitted. His administrative system copied Roman provincial governance. His diplomatic protocols followed Roman precedents. He collected Roman art, employed Roman engineers, and according to some sources, read Roman history in Latin when alone. He fought against Rome not from hatred, but from ambition. He wanted to be what Constantine had been, the barbarian who became emperor, who transformed the empire while preserving it. These two men understood each other in ways their followers never could. They had both sacrificed everything for power. Aetius had murdered rivals, betrayed allies, and sold Roman territory for temporary advantage. Attila had killed his brother, destroyed nations, and turned his people into something they had never been before. They were mirrors of each other, dark reflections of what ambition could achieve and what it cost. When they parted that day, Aetius reportedly said, "We will not meet again." Attila replied, "No, but our sons might." Both statements proved false. They were the last of their kind, and they left no true successors. Within 3 years, both would be dead. Attila from a wedding night hemorrhage or assassination, Aetius murdered by an emperor who feared his power. With them died the last chance for the Roman and Hun empires to find accommodation. Italy burns quietly. Father Dominicus had been the priest of Aquileia for 12 years, shepherding his flock through plague, famine, and the occasional Gothic raid. But nothing had prepared him for the summer of 452 AD, when Attila denied his conquest of Gaul, turned south into Italy, and Aquileia stood first in his path. The siege lasted 3 months, longer than any city had resisted the Huns before. Aquileia's walls were strong, its granaries full, its wells deep. The citizens believed their patron saint would protect them, that their suffering would be rewarded with divine intervention. Father Dominicus led prayers every dawn and dusk. his voice growing hoarse from constant use, his faith growing thin from constant testing. From the church tower, he watched the Hun army spread around his city like a slowly tightening noose. They didn't assault the walls immediately, but instead methodically destroyed everything outside them. Orchards that had grown for generations were cut down, their wood used for siege engines. Villas that had stood since the Republic were dismantled stone by stone. The suburban churches, where the poor had worshipped, were burned after their gold was stripped. The Huns diverted the river that supplied the city's fountains, turning the squares into dust bowls. They catapulted dead animals over the walls, spreading disease. They used Roman prisoners to dig mines under the foundations. And though the miners were detected and killed, everyone knew more tunnels were being dug, that the ground beneath them was becoming honeycomb, ready to collapse. On the 90th day, a section of the northern wall suddenly crumbled, not from assault, but from the patient work of those unknown miners. The Huns poured through like water through a broken dam, and Aquileia's agony began. Father Dominicus watched from his church as systematic destruction replaced the chaos of conquest. The Huns worked in teams, some killing, some looting, some burning, with the efficiency of men who had done this many times before. He saw things that would haunt his remaining days, which wouldn't be many. The city's magistrates crucified on their own judicial benches. The library, with its irreplaceable manuscripts, used as kindling for cooking fires. Children separated from parents, sorted like cattle, the strong taken for slavery, the weak left to starve. The beautiful mosaics in the bathhouse, which had survived 4 centuries, smashed to powder because someone thought there might be gold beneath them. When they came to his church, Father Dominicus was ready. He had sent the young and strong away, keeping only the old, the sick, those who had nowhere to run. He stood in the doorway, holding the gospel, thinking perhaps these pagans might respect a holy man's courage. The Hun who killed him didn't even dismount, simply rode him down and moved on to the gold altar vessels within. By sunset, Aquileia had ceased to exist as a city. The survivors would rebuild something in its place, but it would never again be the jewel of the northern Adriatic. Venice would rise on islands in the lagoon, founded by Aquileian refugees who decided walls weren't enough, that only water could protect them from the horse warriors of the steppes, the bride who killed an empire. Her name was Ildico, and she was probably 16 years old on the night she married Attila in 453 AD. Gothic or Germanic, certainly beautiful, possibly terrified, she was to be his final wife, though neither of them knew it. The wedding was held in one of Attila's wooden palaces on the Hungarian plains, a political marriage to cement an alliance with some Germanic tribe whose name history didn't bother to record. The feast was magnificent by Hun standards, austere by Roman ones. Attila sat on his elevated couch, drinking from a wooden cup, while his guests used captured Roman silver. He ate plain meat and bread while they feasted on delicacies. This was his custom, showing that he was above the luxuries he provided others, that his power came from strength, not gold. Priscus, who wasn't there but collected accounts from those who were, describes Attila as being in unusual spirits. He laughed at the jokes of his fool, something he rarely did. He drank more than his custom, though never to obvious drunkenness. He looked at his young bride with what witnesses described as genuine interest, perhaps even affection, though reading emotions on Attila's weathered face was never easy. As midnight approached, Attila rose, took Ildico's hand, and led her to the bridal chamber. The feast continued, would continue all night, as was customary, the sounds of celebration masking whatever sounds came from within that room. Some witnesses later claimed they heard arguing. Others said they heard nothing unusual. All agreed that when morning came and Attila didn't emerge, no one dared disturb him. It was afternoon before Onagesh, Attila's chief minister, finally ordered the doors broken down. They found Attila dead on his bed, blood pooled beneath him, and Ildiko sitting in the corner, her wedding dress soaked in blood, weeping or pretending to weep, her veil torn as if in mourning. What exactly happened in that room remains one of history's great mysteries. The official story, the one Attila's sons promoted, was that he suffered a massive nosebleed, common among heavy drinkers, and drowned in his own blood. It was an inglorious death for a glorious man, but it avoided the succession crisis that assassination would have triggered. But whispers spoke of other possibilities. The blood seemed too copious for a nosebleed. Ildiko's behaviour was strange, her grief too perfect, too performed. Some claimed she was a Roman agent, others that she acted for her own people, whoever they were. The most romantic story made her an avenger, paying back the destruction of her family, her city, her entire world. Whatever the truth, Ildiko disappeared from history that night. Attila's sons, eager to begin their power struggle, had no interest in investigating their father's death too closely. If Ildiko was murdered to keep her quiet or simply sent away, no record survives. She exists in history for only one night, the night an empire died with its emperor. The Huns gave Attila a funeral worthy of their greatest king. They diverted a river, buried him in its bed with treasures beyond counting, then restored the river's flow. The slaves who dug the grave were killed to protect its location. The warriors who killed the slaves were themselves killed by others. The location of Attila's tomb remains unknown, somewhere beneath Hungarian waters, holding the gold of Rome and the bones of the man who nearly conquered it. Mourning without a king, dawn came late to the Hungarian plains the day after Attila's funeral, the sky heavy with clouds that would bring no rain. In the vast encampment that served as the Hun capital, a strange quiet settled over the wooden halls and felt tense. Not the quiet of mourning, for the official mourning period with its races and feasts had ended. This was the quiet of uncertainty, of an empire holding its breath. In the market squares where Gothic merchants usually haggled with Hun horse traders, conversations were whispered, eyes constantly checking who might be listening. The value of Roman gold coins, stable for a generation under Attila's guarantee, suddenly fluctuated wildly. Some merchants packed their goods, preparing to flee. Others saw opportunity in chaos and raised their prices. The horses knew something had changed. In the royal stables, Attila's personal mounts refused food, pacing their enclosures with nervous energy. The handlers, men who had served Attila for decades, found themselves weeping unexpectedly, not from grief but from a formless fear of what came next. Without the one man who had united dozens of peoples through will and terror, what would hold them together? In the scribal halls where Roman-educated slaves had once written Attila's threatening letters to Constantinople, the work continued from momentum alone. Treaties half-negotiated, tribute lists partially compiled, diplomatic correspondence waiting for a seal that would never come. The chief scribe, a Roman who had served Attila for 15 years, began quietly burning certain documents, records that might prove embarrassing or dangerous in whatever order emerged. The morning light revealed other changes. Some of the Gepard auxiliaries had left during the night, their section of the camp empty except for cold fire pits. A group of Allan cavalry had moved their tents closer together, forming a defensive circle. The Gothic craftsmen had barricaded their workshop, posting guards who had never been necessary when Attila's peace prevailed. By noon, Attila's eldest son, Ellak, had claimed his father's throne, but his brothers Dengizic and Ernak disputed the claim. The careful balance Attila had maintained, playing different ethnic groups against each other while standing above them all, collapsed within hours. Each son gathered their supporters, Ellak with the traditional Hun nobility, Dengizic with the Gothic federates, Ernak with those who dreamed of returning to the steppes. The empire that had made Rome tremble, that had extracted tons of gold in tribute, that had united peoples from the Rhine to the Caucasus, began its dissolution before Attila's grave had settled. Within a year, the sons would be at war. Within 5 years, the Hun Empire would exist only in memory and nightmare. The morning without a king became a year without unity, a decade without purpose, a century where the very name Hun faded from reality into legend. Sons of a dying star, the Hun Empire lasted exactly 18 months after Attila's death, though its dissolution began the moment his body grew cold. His sons, raised in the shadow of greatness, discovered that inheriting an empire built on personal charisma is like inheriting the wind. You can claim it, you can even feel it for a moment, but you cannot hold it. Elak, the eldest, possessed his father's ruthlessness, but none of his vision. Where Attila had used violence as a precise tool, Elak wielded it like a club, believing that enough terror could substitute for respect. Within weeks of claiming leadership, he had alienated the Gothic federates by demanding double tribute, insulted the Gepid nobility by questioning their courage, and frightened even loyal Hun chiefs with arbitrary executions. Picture the Great Council held in the summer of 454 AD, 1 year after Attila's death. The wooden hall, where Attila had received Roman ambassadors, now hosted a gathering that would have been unthinkable under his rule, subject peoples openly debating whether to remain in the confederation. Ardaric, king of the Gepids, stood before Elak, without the subservience that had marked such meetings before. "Your father," Ardaric said, his voice carrying across the silent hall, "treated us as allies. You treat us as slaves. Your father understood that fear and respect must balance. You understand only fear." The accusation hung in the smoky air. Under Attila, such words would have meant immediate death. Under Elak, they met only impotent rage, because Ardaric had brought 5,000 warriors to the council, and everyone knew Elak couldn't afford to lose the Gepids. Dengizich, Attila's second son, watched from the shadows, calculating. He had inherited his father's intelligence, but paired it with an ambition that exceeded his capabilities. While Elak tried to hold the centre through brute force, Dengizich made secret promises to every faction: independence to the Goths, reduced tribute to the Gepids, a return to the steppes for traditional Huns. Promises that contradicted each other, that could never all be kept, but that brought him temporary support. Ernak, the youngest son whom Attila had reportedly favoured, chose a different path. He gathered those Huns who had never been comfortable with empire, who yearned for the simplicity of the old ways. "We have forgotten who we are," he told his followers. "We dress in Roman gold, live in wooden halls, rule from fixed places like farmers. Our ancestors would not recognize us. Better to be poor and free on the steppes than rich and corrupted here." The breaking point came at the Battle of Nidau in 454 AD. The exact location is lost, somewhere in the Pannonian plains where so much blood had already been spilled. Elak faced a coalition of rebellious subject peoples, led by Ardaric. The battle was less a military engagement than a symbol of disintegration. Huns fought Huns, as supporters of different sons chose different sides. Goths fought other Goths, based on which future they preferred. The careful ethnic balance Attila had maintained shattered into dozens of individual conflicts. Elak died in the battle, cut down by Gepid swords, his body lost in the mud of a nameless river crossing. With him died any hope of maintaining Attila's empire intact. Dengizich fled north with those who still followed him, trying to rebuild something from nothing. Ernak led his people east, back toward the steppes their grandfathers had left. Accepting that the great experiment was over, the subject peoples, freed from Hun domination, didn't unite in celebration. Instead, they immediately began fighting each other for the scraps of empire. The Gepids claimed Pannonia. The Goths took portions of the Danube frontier. The Rugians, Siri, and Heruli carved out tiny kingdoms that would last a few years or decades before being absorbed by stronger powers. The Hun Empire didn't transfer to new management. It simply ceased to exist, like a soap bubble popping, leaving only moisture in the air to mark where it had been. You are Dengizich, last of the blood. You are Dengizich, son of Attila, and it is the winter of 468 AD. You huddle in a felt tent that would have embarrassed your father's meanest servant, surrounded by perhaps 3,000 followers, all that remains of the hundreds of thousands who once called themselves Huns. Outside, the wind howls across the frozen Danubian plains, carrying the smell of snow and failure. You remember the palace you grew up in, the wooden halls hung with Roman silk, the gold flowing like water through your father's hands. You remember sitting at his feet as a child, watching him receive ambassadors from Constantinople, their faces pale with fear, their hands trembling as they offered tribute. You remember thinking that such power was permanent, that being Attila's son meant something indestructible. Now you sit on frozen ground, eating horse meat that's gone slightly bad, listening to your remaining chiefs argue about whether to raid the Goths or beg the Romans for federate status. The irony isn't lost on you. The sons of the empire that terrorized Rome, now debating whether Rome might accept them as just another barbarian tribe, needing land and protection. Your hands, once soft from a youth of privilege, are now cracked and bleeding from the cold. The ring your father gave you, gold and garnets taken from some Roman noble, you traded last month for grain to feed your people through the worst of winter. You tell yourself this is temporary, that spring will bring new opportunities, that the name of Attila still carries weight. But the younger warriors look at you with barely concealed contempt, and you know they follow you only because the alternatives are worse. You've tried everything. You sent ambassadors to Constantinople, offering to serve as federates, to fight the empire's enemies in exchange for gold and land. The emperor's response was laughter and a demand that you return all Roman prisoners, of which you have none because you can barely feed your own people. You approach the Goths, your father's former allies, suggesting a joint campaign against Rome. They responded by raiding your camps, taking what little you had left. Tonight, your scouts report that a Roman army approaches, not the massive legions your father faced, but a small force, perhaps 5,000 men. Once, this would have been an opportunity for easy victory and plunder. Now, you wonder if your hungry, demoralized warriors can stand against Roman discipline. You wonder if you even want them to. You step outside the tent, looking at the stars your father taught you to navigate by. Tengri, the eternal blue sky, seems infinitely distant, uncaring. You remember your father saying that the sky god favors the strong, abandons the weak. By that measure, you have been thoroughly abandoned, yet you cannot give up. You are Dengizich, last of Attila's blood to claim kingship, and tomorrow you will lead your people into battle one more time. The battle will be a massacre. Your starving warriors will break at the first Roman charge. You will die with a Roman spear in your belly, crawling in the mud, calling for a father who cannot hear you. Your head will be displayed in Constantinople's forum, and citizens who once trembled at Hun raids will throw rotten vegetables at it. The last king of the Huns will become a carnival attraction, a reassurance to Romans that their nightmares are truly dead. The vanishing, where did they go? The disappearance of the Huns from history is perhaps more remarkable than their sudden appearance. Within a generation of Attila's death, the ethnic label Hun had virtually vanished from contemporary records. A people who had dominated European nightmares for nearly a century simply ceased to exist as a distinct group. Where did hundreds of thousands of people go? The answer lies not in a single exodus, but in 1,000 small absorptions. The Huns, never numerous compared to their subject peoples, had ruled through military superiority and political organization. When both collapsed after Attila's death, they faced a choice: maintain a separate identity in weakness, or merge with stronger groups. Most chose survival over ethnic pride. Consider the Huns who had settled in Pannonia, Modern Hungary. Archaeological evidence from the late 5th century shows a gradual shift in burial practices. Hun-style graves, with their characteristic horse burials and composite bows, become increasingly mixed with Gothic and Gepid elements. Within 2 generations, the graves are indistinguishable from those of the surrounding populations. The Huns didn't leave. They became Gepids, Goths, or whatever group controlled their local area. The Roman Empire, both Eastern and Western, actively recruited former Hun warriors. These were, after all, some of the finest cavalry in the world, and Rome always needed good soldiers. The Notitia Dignitatum, a late Roman administrative document, lists several military units with suspiciously Hunnic names serving in the Roman army. These former terror of Rome now defended Roman frontiers, their children growing up as Roman citizens, their grandchildren forgetting that their ancestors had made emperors tremble. Some Huns followed Ernak back to the steppes, where they were absorbed into new confederations. The Bulgars, who would later establish a powerful medieval kingdom, claimed descent from Attila's youngest son. The Avars, who troubled Byzantium in the 6th century, incorporated Hun elements. The Magyars, who conquered Hungary in the 9th century, told stories of inheriting the land from Attila's people, though whether this was history or convenient mythology remains debated. Language provides another clue to Hun dissolution. If Hunnic was a distinct language, it died with remarkable speed. No texts survive, no inscriptions, not even graffiti. The children of Hun warriors learned Gothic, Latin, or whatever language dominated their region. Within 2 generations, Hunnic existed only in personal names, and even these were often adapted to local linguistic patterns. Attila's name survived, but transformed. Attila in Norse sagas, Etzel in German legends, each culture claiming him as their own. Intermarriage accelerated the vanishing. Hun warriors, often possessing gold and military skills, were attractive marriage partners in the post-Attila chaos. Hun women, especially those from noble families, married into Gothic, Gepid, and Roman aristocracies. Their children bore mixed names, claimed multiple heritages, and within a generation, the Hun component was just one thread in a complex ethnic tapestry. The process wasn't always peaceful. Some sources hint at active persecution of Huns after Attila's death, revenge for decades of terror. The 6th century historian Jordanes, himself of Gothic descent, writes with barely concealed satisfaction about Huns being hunted down, enslaved, or killed. But more often, the absorption was gradual, voluntary, even welcomed. Being Hun had meant power under Attila. After him, it meant vulnerability. Perhaps most tellingly, no one tried to preserve Hun identity. Unlike the Jews in diaspora or the Armenians scattered across empires, the Huns established no communities dedicated to maintaining their traditions. They built no churches or temples to their gods, wrote no histories of their people, created no institutions to pass on their culture. When the political structure that defined them collapsed, they had no cultural infrastructure to maintain group cohesion. By the year 500 AD, less than 50 years after Attila's death, the Huns, as a distinct people, had vanished from Europe. They left behind no monuments, no literature, no successor states claiming their legacy. They survived only in the nightmares of chroniclers, the DNA of scattered populations, and the archaeological traces that modern science struggles to interpret. The people who had seemed poised to conquer the world simply merged into it, becoming everyone and no one simultaneously. Winds across empty camps. Stand in the Hungarian plains on an autumn evening when the wind blows from the east, and you might hear something that isn't quite the wind. Local farmers, ploughing fields that have been worked for 1500 years, still occasionally turn up artifacts. A corroded bit from a Hun bridle, an arrowhead of unusual design, sometimes fragments of those great bronze cauldrons that once held feast meals for hundreds. The archaeological site near Szeged, excavated repeatedly over the past century, reveals layers of occupation like pages in a book. At the deepest level, dated to the mid-5th century, lies what was once a significant Hun settlement. Not the mobile camp of pure nomads, but something more permanent. Workshops for metalworking, storage pits for grain, the post holes of substantial buildings. This was a place where Huns were beginning to settle, to transform from nomads to something else. But the site's most eloquent feature is how it ends. No destruction layer, no evidence of battle or burning, simply abandonment. One season people lived here, the next season they were gone. Tools left in workshops, grain still in storage pits, as if the inhabitants expected to return but never did. The wind and rain claimed it slowly, gently, filling in the post holes, covering the pathways, until only subtle variations in soil colour remained to mark where Europe's terror once planned their campaigns. The horses, remember, perhaps, the Przewalski's horses of Mongolia, the last truly wild horses, carry genetic markers that link them to the mounts of ancient steppe warriors. When they run across the grasslands, manes flowing, hooves drumming the earth, they recreate sounds that once meant doom for cities from China to France. But they run now without riders, without purpose beyond the joy of running itself. In the marshes along the Tisa River, where Attila may have held court, where his brother Bleda met his mysterious end, the landscape has returned to its pre-Hun state. Birds nest in reeds that might have been cut for arrow shafts. Fish swim, where warriors once watered their horses. The only human traces are the occasional fisherman's boat, the distant sound of a tractor, the contrails of jets heading to Budapest. The Huns left no permanent mark here, and the earth has healed completely from their presence. The transformation of fear into legend. The Huns began transforming from history into mythology even before the last Hun warrior died. By the 6th century, chroniclers who had never seen a Hun were describing them in terms that owed more to biblical demons than historical reality. They became God's scourge, divine punishment for sin, a force of nature rather than a human society with understandable motivations and methods. Gregory of Tours, writing in the late 6th century, describes Attila as having the head of a giant, eyes that shot fire, and the ability to summon storms. The historical Attila, that calculating politician who spoke multiple languages and conducted careful diplomacy, disappeared beneath layers of supernatural terror. Each retelling added new impossibilities until the man became indistinguishable from the myth. The Catholic Church found the Huns particularly useful as moral instruction. Sermons described them as God's flail, sent to punish a sinful world. Cities that fell to the Huns were retrospectively described as particularly wicked. Cities that survived were blessed, their salvation proof of divine favour. The complex political and military realities of the 5th century simplified into a morality play where faith defeated paganism, civilization overcame barbarism. But the most fascinating transformation occurred in Germanic oral traditions, where Attila became not a destroyer, but a noble king. In the Nibelungenlied, he appears as Etzel, a generous ruler who hosts heroes, marries the beautiful Kriemhild, and presides over a magnificent court. The historical ironies are breathtaking. The Germanic peoples who fled the Huns in terror reimagined Attila as the epitome of royal virtue. This Germanic Attila Etzel is wealthy but not greedy, powerful but not cruel, a widower seeking love rather than a polygamous warlord collecting diplomatic marriages. When treachery erupts in his hall, he's the victim, not the perpetrator. The audience is meant to sympathize with him, to see his losses as tragic rather than deserved. The same cultures that the historical Attila terrorized transformed him into a figure of sympathy and respect. The Scandinavian sagas took different approaches. In the Volsunga saga, Attila becomes Atli, still recognizable but transformed into a figure from Norse mythology rather than history. He marries Gudrun, seeks the treasure of the Nibelungs, and dies not from a wedding night hemorrhage, but from his wife's calculated revenge. The historical Ildiko becomes the mythological Gudrun, transformed from possible assassin to certain avenger. Her motives clear, her actions justified. These legendary transformations served purposes beyond entertainment. They allowed cultures to process historical trauma, to take control of memories that had once controlled them. By turning Attila into Etzel or Atli, by making him part of their own stories rather than an external destroyer, European cultures domesticated their deepest fears. The uncontrollable became controllable through narrative. Meanwhile, in distant Mongolia, entirely different legends arose. There, Attila wasn't known at all, but stories of the Xiongnu, who might have been the Huns' ancestors, evolved into tales of heroes who rode west to conquer unknown lands. Whether these stories preserve genuine memories or represent later romanticization remains unknown, but the idea persists in Mongolian folklore that some of their ancestors rode so far west they never returned, establishing kingdoms in lands beyond the setting sun. Attila, in the sagas. In the great hall of King Olaf Tryggvason, on a winter night in the year 998 AD, the skald Thorstein saga maker stood before assembled warriors and began to tell a story his grandfather had told him, which his grandfather's grandfather had heard from traders who came from the distant south. "Listen," Thorstein began, his voice carrying over the crackling fire, "to the tale of Atli the Hun king, who ruled when the world was younger and gold flowed like water through the halls of the mighty. This Atli was brother-in-law to Gunnar the Brave and Hogni the Wise. Having married their sister Gudrun, after her first husband Sigurd Dragonslayer met his doom." The warriors leaned forward. They knew this story, had heard versions of it since childhood, but a good skald could make even familiar tales fresh. Thorstein continued, weaving the tale of how Atli invited his brothers-in-law to a great feast, claiming friendship but planning treachery. He wanted the gold of the Niflungs, the cursed treasure that Sigurd had won from the dragon Fafnir. Gudrun knew her husband's heart, Thorstein intoned, knew that honour meant nothing to him beside gold. She sent her brothers a ring wrapped in wolf's hair, warning them of the trap. But Gunnar and Hogni came anyway, for a warrior cannot live forever, and better to die with honour than hide from fate. The battle in Atli's hall lasted 3 days and 3 nights, according to Thorstein's telling. Gunnar and Hogni, with only 30 companions, held off 400 Hun warriors. The walls ran red with blood. The floor became slippery with the fallen. When capture finally came, it came through treachery. Atli's men set fire to the hall, forcing the brothers into the open. Atli offered Gunnar his life for the location of the hidden gold. Gunnar demanded to see his brother's heart first, to know that Hogni was truly dead. They brought him the heart of a thrall, but Gunnar knew it was false because it trembled with fear. Then they brought Hogni's heart, and Gunnar laughed, for now he alone knew the secret, and it would die with him. The hall was silent except for the fire's whisper. Everyone knew how this ended, but they wanted to hear it anyway. Thorstein described how they threw Gunnar into a pit of serpents, how he played his harp with his toes when his hands were bound, how the snakes swayed to his music until one, deaf to beauty, struck the fatal blow. But Atli's triumph was hollow. Thorstein continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. That night, Gudrun served him a special feast. The meat was tender, the wine sweet. Only after he had eaten did she tell him he had consumed the hearts of his own sons, that she had killed them to avenge her brothers. And while he sat stunned by wine and horror, she drove a blade through his heart, then burned his hall with all his treasures inside. The story ended with Gudrun walking into the sea, seeking her own death, but rescued by waves that carried her to a new land and a new story. The warriors in Olaf's hall sat silent for a moment, then erupted in appreciation, pounding tables and praising Thorstein's telling. None of them knew or cared that the historical Attila had no connection to the Burgundian royal family, that he never captured any cursed treasure, that he died in bed rather than by his wife's blade. The story had become more real than history, its emotional truth superseding its factual falseness. Genetic ghosts, the DNA evidence. In a laboratory in Budapest, Dr. Eva Neparachki carefully extracts DNA from a 1500-year-old tooth, part of a skeleton excavated from a Hun period cemetery near Shade. The tooth, barely larger than a fingernail, might contain answers to questions historians have debated for generations. Who were the Huns genetically? Where did they come from? Where did their descendants go? The results, published in multiple studies over the past decade, paint a picture more complex than anyone expected. The Huns weren't a genetically homogeneous population, but a confederation of diverse peoples. The DNA shows markers from East Asia, particularly similarities to populations from Mongolia and southern Siberia. But it also shows European markers, Iranian markers, a genetic cocktail that speaks to centuries of intermarriage, even before the Huns arrived in Europe. Most intriguingly, some Hun samples show genetic markers associated with the Xiongnu, the Steppe confederation that troubled China for centuries, before disappearing westward at approximately the right time to emerge as the European Huns. The connection isn't definitive. The genetic overlap could indicate shared steppe ancestry rather than direct descent, but it's suggestive enough to keep the debate alive. Modern Hungarian populations show approximately 2 to 4% of genetic markers that might be traceable to the Huns, though distinguishing Hun ancestry from later steppe migrations, particularly the Magyar conquest of the 9th century, remains challenging. The genetic legacy, like the historical one, is real but diluted, present but difficult to isolate. More surprising are genetic traces found far from the traditional Hun territories. Populations in Bavaria show markers that might indicate Hun ancestry. Certain family lines in northern Italy carry genetic signatures consistent with 5th century steppe populations. Even some British populations show faint traces that might, emphasis on might, connect to Hun auxiliaries who served with Roman legions in Britain. But DNA tells only part of the story. Genes don't carry language, culture, or identity. A person might carry Hun genetic markers while having no knowledge of that ancestry, no connection to Hun culture, no inheritance beyond the molecular. The Huns who vanished from history live on in DNA, but as ghosts, present but unrecognized, influential but invisible. The search continues. Each new skeleton, excavated from the right period, each new advance in genetic analysis technology might provide additional pieces to the puzzle. But perhaps the mystery itself is the most appropriate legacy for a people who built no monuments, wrote no books, and left no successors. They remain what they always were, present in their effects rather than their artifacts, known by what they changed rather than what they created. The eternal nomad. The wind moves across the Eurasian steppe as it has for 10,000 years, carrying seeds, dust, and memories that have no human witness. From Hungary to Mongolia, the grasslands remember footsteps that no longer fall, hoofbeats that no longer thunder, voices that no longer call across the endless space. In Mongolia, herders still practice traditions that Attila might recognize. They drink fermented mare's milk, though they call it airag now instead of kumis. They raise their children on horseback, though the horses now share the grasslands with motorcycles. They move their jurs, the felt tents Europeans called yurts, following the grass, following the seasons, following patterns older than any empire. These modern nomads aren't Huns, but they carry something of the Hun experience forward. They understand what settled peoples never quite grasp. That wealth isn't just what you can hold, but what you can move. That power isn't just what you control, but what you can abandon without loss. That home isn't a place, but a way of being in the world. The steppe teaches the same lessons now that it taught then. Winter still kills the weak. Summer still demands movement to fresh pastures. The sky still stretches infinite and blue, the eternal Tengri that the Huns worshipped, though few call it by that name anymore. The horizon still beckons with promises of better grass, richer lands, new possibilities beyond the next rise. But the world has changed around the steppe. Satellites photograph every square metre, borders cut across traditional migration routes, cities spread into grasslands that once knew only the temporary touch of hooves. The nomadic life that created the Huns becomes harder to maintain each year, pressed by modernity that has no patience for people who refuse to stay in one place. Yet something persists. In Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, in the Altai Mountains, in Inner Mongolia, people still choose movement over settlement. They adapt, using solar panels to power their gers, cell phones to coordinate migrations, trucks to move what horses once carried. But the essential choice remains: to flow rather than fix, to adapt rather than resist, to see the world as a vast possibility rather than an owned plot. The Huns failed as empire builders because they succeeded too well as nomads. They couldn't transform into what conquest required, couldn't become the Romans they defeated, couldn't build the permanent structures that empire demands. Their failure was also their integrity. They remained what they were, even when being something else might have preserved their power. The wind continues its eternal movement across the grasslands. It carries no messages from the past, makes no promises about the future. It simply moves, as nomads move, as the Huns moved, following patterns older than history and more enduring than any empire. Why we remember destroyers. There's something deeply unsettling about how vividly we remember those who destroyed versus those who created. We know Attila's name 1500 years after his death, but who can name the architects who built Constantinople's walls? We remember the Huns who burned libraries, but not the scholars who wrote the books. We preserve the names of conquerors in our nightmares while forgetting the dreams of their victims. This isn't simply about dramatic events making better stories. The human mind seems designed to privilege threats over opportunities, to remember danger more clearly than safety. The amygdala, that ancient part of our brain that processes fear, creates memories with an intensity that peaceful experiences rarely match. We evolved to remember which rustling bush concealed a predator, not which one concealed nothing. The Huns perfected the art of being remembered through fear. They didn't just defeat enemies, they created spectacular displays of destruction that burned themselves into collective memory. A city peacefully trading for generations leaves few dramatic stories. A city consumed by flames in a single night creates a narrative that echoes through centuries. Consider how children still play games involving Huns, though transformed and sanitized. Here come the Huns. Variations exist across Europe, usually involving one group chasing another. The specific details are forgotten, but the pattern persists. The Huns are coming, and you must flee. Playground games preserve historical trauma in ways that museums and books cannot quite match. Modern popular culture continues this fascination. Films, novels, and video games regularly feature Attila and the Huns, almost always as antagonists, as forces of destruction that heroes must overcome. We've made them into orcs, zombies, alien invaders, any threatening other that tests civilization's defenses. The specific identity matters less than the function, external threat that justifies internal unity. But perhaps we remember destroyers because they reveal something essential about the fragility of what we build. The Huns showed that Rome, eternal Rome, was actually quite mortal. They demonstrated that all our walls, our laws, our accumulated wealth and wisdom could be swept away by people who didn't value what we valued, who saw our treasures as merely things to take or burn. This knowledge haunts us. Every civilization believes itself permanent until it isn't. The Huns remind us that there's always something beyond the border, always forces that don't share our assumptions, always the possibility that everything we've built could vanish like Aquileia, leaving only archaeological traces for future scholars to puzzle over. Yet in remembering the Huns primarily as destroyers, we miss something essential. They were also creators, innovators, adapters. They created a political system that united disparate peoples. They innovated military tactics that revolutionized warfare. They adapted to environments from the Mongolian steppe to the Hungarian plain. But creation is quiet, destruction is loud, and human memory privileges the loud. Perhaps the true lesson of the Huns isn't about destruction, but about impermanence. They burst into history from nowhere, dominated their age, then vanished almost without trace. They remind us that nothing is permanent, not their empire, not the empires they destroyed, not the memory of either except what we choose to preserve and retell, generation after generation, transforming history into legend, legend into myth, myth into the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we fear. Closing circle, return to mystery. And so we return to where we began, with a paradox wrapped in mystery, sealed in silence. The Huns, who made the world tremble, left barely a whisper in the historical record. They conquered but didn't rule, destroyed but didn't build, appeared from nowhere and returned to nowhere, leaving only questions where other peoples left answers. Stand in the Hungarian plains, where Attila once held court, and you find nothing. No ruins of palaces, no monuments to victories, no tombs marking royal graves. The earth has healed completely from their presence. Grass grows where wooden halls once stood. Wildflowers bloom where warriors once gathered. The landscape remembers nothing, or perhaps remembers everything but keeps its secrets. The greatest mystery remains their origin. Were they the Xiongnu who troubled China, transformed by centuries of westward migration? Were they an entirely different people who emerged from the Central Asian crucible? Were they even a people at all, or just a confederation that created an identity through shared action rather than shared ancestry? Every answer spawns new questions. Every theory reveals new gaps in our knowledge. Their language haunts us with its absence. Somewhere in the 5th century, children learned Hunnic as their first words. Lovers whispered Hunnic endearments. Poets might have composed Hunnic verses. All of it gone, not even fragments surviving, as if the language itself was too wild to be caged in writing. We have Roman descriptions of how fearsome Hun war cries sounded, but we don't have the words themselves. We know the terror, but not the text. Even Attila himself remains more mystery than man. We know what he did, but not really why he did it. Was he trying to create a new form of empire, synthesizing nomadic and settled civilizations? Was he simply an opportunist, taking what he could while he could? Was there a grand vision behind his campaigns, or just the momentum of success? He left no memoirs, no recorded philosophy, no statement of intentions. We have only actions without explanations, effects without stated causes. The Huns challenge our desire for neat historical narratives. They refuse to fit into our categories of rise and fall, civilization and barbarism, success and failure. They were barbarians who understood Roman administration better than many Romans. They were failures who extracted more wealth from Rome than any successful conqueror. They were destroyers who enabled the creation of new European kingdoms. They were nobody who became everybody's nightmare. In the end, the Huns remain what they always were, a force of change rather than an entity, a process rather than a product. They were the storm that cleared old growth, so new forests could grow, the flood that destroyed but also fertilized, the fire that consumed but also renewed. They didn't build a civilization, they were the crucible in which new civilizations were forged. Their true monument isn't stone or gold or written words, but the shape of the world that came after them. The Europe that emerged from the Hun storm was fundamentally different from what came before, more diverse, more dynamic, more aware of its vulnerability. The Huns taught Europe that walls weren't enough, that gold couldn't buy safety, that the world beyond the borders was vast and powerful and impossible to ignore. As we close this journey through shadows and echoes, remember that history is full of Huns, forces that appear from beyond our vision, shake our certainties, and vanish, leaving only questions. They remind us that the past is not a closed book, but an ongoing mystery, that what we think we know is always provisional, always subject to revision, when new evidence emerges from the ground or from forgotten archives. The Huns rode out of mystery into terror, into legend, into silence. They remain in that silence still, neither fully historical nor completely mythological, neither entirely real nor safely fictional. They are the shadow that shaped the light, the absence that defines presence, the destroyers who accidentally created the world we inherited. Thank you for joining me on this long journey into the past. The thunder of their hoofbeats has faded. The dust of their passage has settled. But the questions they raised echo still across the centuries, reminding us that history is never truly finished, never completely known, always ready to surprise us with new mysteries drawn from old earth. Sleep peacefully, wandering through history's quiet gardens.